Hello and welcome to the CivilTalk Podcast. I'm your host, Tapasio Althouse. If you're new to the show, this is where we explore civility and social emotional learning with esteemed guests, expert insights, and practical advice to help people navigate the world. Today, I'm thrilled to sit down with someone who is reshaping the way we think about education, leadership, and social emotional learning in public schools across the country. David Adams is the Chief Executive Officer of the Urban Assembly, a nonprofit based in New York's financial district that creates innovative tools and school programs focused on student growth. Since joining the organization in 2014, David has made waves, first as the Director of Social Emotional Learning, where he developed the Resilient Scholars Program, a model that integrates SEL directly into curriculum and classroom culture. That program has since expanded nationwide, serving students in Los Angeles, Houston, Syracuse, and beyond. As a strategic leader and advocate for educational equity, he has also helped position the Urban Assembly as a national model for school support and innovation. He's a champion of Equity Award recipient and currently serves on the board of CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. David also co-authored the Educator's Practical Guide to Emotional Intelligence and has published multiple papers on the connection between emotional competence and academic outcomes. In today's episode, we're diving into how SEL can be embedded into systems, not just taught in classrooms. From education to equity to emotional intelligence, David truly brings a unique and deeply human perspective to every space he enters, and we are so excited to have him here today. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you so much. I am very happy to be here.
Thank you. So I want to start with the Urban Assembly. For listeners who may not be familiar, can you share what the Urban Assembly is and just the vision behind its work in public education?
Sure, Tabasco. So you did such a great job in that intro, talking about what we've done and what we care about. But we are an educational nonprofit that designs educational solutions in our network of 22 schools, and then scales those solutions from our schools to all schools. So we focus on solutions in social and emotional learning. We focus on solutions in instructional quality, and we focus on solutions in post-secondary readiness and access.
So you've helped position, the Urban Assembly as a national leader in, SEL integration. What's the core philosophy that drives the Urban Assembly, or drives how the Urban Assembly approaches social emotional learning in schools?
It's a great question, right? So our mission is to advance students' economic and social mobility by improving public education. And we do that by investing in the whole student. We want students who can solve problems. We want students who can manage themselves effectively and relate to others effectively. We want students who can collaborate and work in groups. And those are social and emotional skills. And so the way we think about this is we look at our instructional practices, our behavioral supports, our social emotional supports, our extracurricular activities, and we look to see how they activate or directly teach social and emotional skills. We layer that on top of things like feedback and assessment in order to ensure that every student across the grades have access to the highest quality social and emotional development so that they can go out into the world and use those social and emotional skills to solve problems and thrive in college, career, and community.
Okay. How do you integrate that into programs? So you're talking about, getting a lay of the land of the educational structure, whether it be extracurricular or even just, your formative classes. How do you integrate SEL into that? SEL, there's so many different pillars, and how you connect it to education, whether it be, in K to 12, I feel like it has to have a certain standard. It has to speak to children. How do you, link up to the brains of young minds and make sure that social emotional learning is cutting through in these extracurricular classes?
Well, the first thing you have to do is you got to name the skill or the concept you're working on. We do that through direct instruction and through feedback from teachers to students.
Mm-hmm.
When you understand what you're teaching, then you can start to see that skill in different aspects of the school environment. So let's just take a competency under relationship skills. Let's use communications. And then let's talk about the skill of turning and talking and taking turns in a conversation, right? So to pass you talk, I listen, and then I talk and you listen. And we're pretty good at podcasts, but that's not actually a skill that's widely distributed. I don't know about you, but I've been in one or two conversations where turn taking in conversation is not as obvious to both parties as it could be.
Right.
So once we name that there's an idea that there is um, a cadence to a conversation, then when we do the turn and talking instructional format, where students say, hey, let's talk about this subject, a teacher is more able to recognize that they're doing two things. They're increasing student discourse and increasing the depth of knowledge around the content they're talking about, and they're practicing social and emotional skills like active listening and turn taking in conversation. Now, once you teach it, you activate it, and you get feedback on it, students are able to generalize that skill from the instructional format that they learned it in to things like extracurricular activities, things like the community, things like going home and having a conversation across the dinner table. So really it's a three-part space. First, you teach it, which creates the concept. Then you create opportunities for students to practice that concept. Make sure they're aware of the concept that they're practicing while they're doing it in the different areas. And then you get feedback. Hey, when you did that turn and talk, how well did you hear what your colleague was saying, and how well did you listen to what they were talking about in terms of your turn taking? And that's when you develop social and emotional competencies in your students that are generalizable from schools to communities and, of course, the world of work.
Yeah. I think it's really great also to give, I wish that I received these tools when I was in my formative years. I didn't really understand anything about SEL or the pillars that sort of undermined it until a lot later than life. But I think one of the key things that I think is so exciting about what you're doing is giving kids the vocabulary, telling them you are actively listening, because these seem like such adult terms, for a kid. So it's really cool that you're able to say, okay, you are showing empathy, you're showing compassion, you are showing reciprocation, you are actively listening, and being able to give these kids this vocabulary, I think is super liberating. Do you get a sense that from these kids, there's a general excitement or maybe even ambivalent? What sort of energy do you get from the students regarding this?
I think students get incredibly excited to learn that there are skills that allow them to solve problems interpersonally and intrapersonally, and that these skills can be learned. Everything from the mental health crisis, where students are struggling really to manage their emotions effectively, to somebody stepped on my shoe and I'm feeling angry about it, and I don't necessarily have the tools to make amends, to communicate that anger in ways that are not violent and physical. When we give young people tools to solve problems and they use those tools. Now, it helps when we model as adults those problem-solving tools that we are equipping our young people with, because it brings value to those tools and makes it seem like it's not just something we're learning as kids, but we're all doing as a community, as a society together. And ultimately, when we teach these skills, when we model these skills, and then when we elevate them through our values, young people feel empowered to solve problems constructively. And that's the kind of young people we want in our society. Social and emotionally competent young people who we want as our neighbors, who we want as our doctors, who we want as our policemen and our firemen, and the people who make our society great. And so that's why we're invested in social and emotional learning as at the Urban Assembly, so that we can have young people with the kind of social and emotional competence that drives our society to success.
Yeah. It's great. What happens when teaching SEL is a rewarding experience, and I'm lucky too, because I get to have, a podcast and work in that field as well. And a lot of it feels really positive, because you're trying to spread positivity in a certain way. What happens when you sort of reach a student, or maybe even a school system that sort of pushes back on what you're trying to sort of teach?
It's a great question. So my recommendation here is to get as granular as possible. We know social and emotional learning is the process by which students develop competencies of self-management, self-awareness, responsible decision-making, etc., right? So the learning part of that is that process. Now, the outcome of that is students' ability to demonstrate social and emotional competence and solve problems in the inter and interpersonal domain. When I go to parents and I say, hey, does anybody want a student to learn decision making or not want a student to learn decision making skills? Does
Right.
anybody want a student not to think before they act? Does anybody want a student who struggles to communicate their needs and wants effectively? I haven't seen a parent raise their hand and say, yes, I want that for my child. I want my child to not be able to manage their emotions or set and achieve goals. I want my child to not have a sense of personal responsibility. I want my child not to know how to communicate in a group or contribute to their communities. So it's really about getting granular about what it is that we're trying to teach our young people. And when we do that, most parents wake up saying, it's good enough for me. I'm still working on my management of my emotions. I'm still working on making good decisions and stopping and thinking before I act. And I think that's good enough for my child as well. And when I explain it to parents in really specific terms and show them how we teach young people to stop and think before they act, how we teach young people to communicate I'm messaging, I'm feeling X when you do Y in order to resolve conflicts more effectively. Most parents are like, that's good for my children, that's good for my community, and that's good for our schools and our society.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. You get to also, it's a strengthening between, the student, the child, I guess, and parents too, So not only does it probably play out academically, but it bleeds into relationships outside of school, which is really great. So the Resilient, the Resilient Scholars Program, I'd love to hear more about that and sort of
Yeah.
what inspired its creation.
Yeah, so right now we have a situation where 90% of school leaders say they want to do social emotional learning, but only 10% of those school leaders have a plan to actually implement it. So the Resilient Scholars Program really helps schools organize around these principles of social and emotional development. And we do that through the Scan, Plan, Act model. We scan the environment for opportunities to develop social and emotional skills by looking at your instructional practices, your behavioral supports, your extracurricular activities. We look at your social emotional supports, your adult SEL, and we think about, okay, where are the opportunities to teach directly social emotional skills and where are the opportunities to activate those social emotional skills in those domains of school functioning. Then we align those to outcomes around data so that students can receive feedback in terms of how they're practicing those social emotional skills. We make sure adults understand where there are opportunities to develop those social emotional competencies across those 5 domains. We help schools plan, and then we collect evidence to demonstrate that what we plan for is actually happening in schools and districts across the country. So it's really a guided implementation model. And the output here is young people, again, who can demonstrate the social and emotional competencies that they need in order to solve the problems of life and be successful in college, career, and their communities.
How long does that, I mean, that's amazing. How long does that scan, how long does it last? Because that's a big metric, So I'm sitting here, I'm like, man, that's a lot of manpower, woman power, How long does that scan of the sort of environment that you're talking about last?
Well, it's a great question. So, what we do is really look at 5 activities against each of those domains. So, for example, we'll look at your 5 most frequent or most prevalent instructional activities. And then we'll say something like stations is often used in elementary school and pre-K, where there are stations of what students can do, and students move from station to station and make choices around that. And we'll say, oh, did you know? And usually it's actually the school, that's actually teaching young people decision-making skills, reinforcing their sense of responsibility, and helping them resolve conflicts, because when they go to a station and maybe somebody else was using a toy or something, they need to activate these conflict resolution skills, right? So this process takes about 3 to 4 hours to really go through schools' activities and start to say, hey, where does this live in the social and emotional domain of functioning? Now, in high school, you might look at something like a Socratic dialogue or a Socratic seminar, and you might think about, oh, this is actually reinforcing social awareness, looking at social cues when students are talking, or when you're doing collaborative problem solving, which is what a lot of our schools do. project-based learning, not only are you working on your self-management, getting the project done on time, but you're working on your communication and relationship skills. And of course, you're working to collaborate in a group. So once we identify what schools are doing, we start to kind of pull the social emotional competencies out of them, make sure they're being directly taught to students so students have the opportunity to name and understand the framework and the construct they're using, and then activate them within these instructional formats, these behavior supports, these extracurricular activities, so that a basketball coach is using the same language as your teacher, who's using the same language as your guidance counselor, who's using the same language as your AP when they're looking at your behavioral structures to support students' effective decision making.
Yeah, I mean, it's a community effort, you know. And
that's right. Really, it takes a village.
It does, especially when you have like a whole, you know, school. It's not just you and your kid or 2 kids or 3 kids. There's like hundreds of kids here, so it takes more than a village, you know. So that's really cool that you know, make sure the adults are really like using the same vocabulary, you know, to sort of like penetrate that like into heads and be like, okay, this is what we're all learning, you know. Yes. So what do you advise to educators and parents who sort of don't have these programs yet in their schools? Because I know that, you know, SEL is not new. Emotional intelligence is not new, but it is sort of trickling into universities and to K through 12 slowly but surely. What do you recommend that teachers and parents do if these curriculums aren't in their schools yet?
It's a great question. So first, we have to know that even if you're not explicitly teaching social and emotional skills, you're asking students to demonstrate those social emotional skills in the format of their instructional practices, in the way that you organize your behavioral support systems, and in everything really that you do in a school. You're pulling from student social and emotional competencies, right? So let me just give you an example, Tabasio. Let's say, hey, we're going to do a turn and talk. I want you to turn to your neighbor and talk about the work that's happening. Maybe I just talk for all 4 minutes and I don't give my partner an opportunity to respond. That's because I haven't been taught how to have an effective conversation and listen effectively, right? So we're asking students to do things that they have not yet necessarily been taught to do. And so we create access to our society. We create access to our classrooms. We create access to participation in the world of work when students have explicit development in these skills. Different parents have different philosophies for how to regulate their emotions. Some people throw things on the ground. Some people drink too much. Some people get really quiet. But we know that when we teach a varied amount of strategies to young people, it's some in their academics. So I would say we need to stop taking this for granted. We need to stop relying on chance to incorporate and to empower young people to be successful in the social and emotional domain. We don't take it to chance that kids learn how to read. We teach kids how to read because we expect them to read in society. We don't give it a chance that kids learn numeracy skills because we expect them to be able to solve math problems. We expect young people to demonstrate social and emotional competencies. It's time for us to take a moment, know what those social emotional competencies are, understand the underlying skills that empower them, and teach our young people to be successful in school, work, and life. We can do it. We know the research demonstrates when we do it, students are less likely to have behavioral problems, less likely to be on drugs or alcohol challenges, do better in school, have better jobs. So our job is to take that research, put it into practice, and empower young people to be successful in their lives.
Yeah. Yeah, you know what, you're right. It's like parents, and I mean, specifically parents, you know, really deal with problems, and, you know, you have nonviolent communication. There's so many different ways and theories, but they all kind of like have the same underlying message, and it's just empathy, you know, and it's just sort of being curious about your fellow human. And I think you're right, and you have to really, parents and maybe not so much educators, you know, I think it's a lot harder for educators to implement something when it's not under sort of the rubric that's given. But for parents, you know, I think it's really important to sort of set that standard at home too, and sort of take that ability into their own hands, you know, and set aside 10 minutes maybe during dinner and have conversations with your kids where you're practicing these things, you know. And I don't think it's that hard. I think it's like a really beautiful way to sort of connect to your children, and to connect with yourself too.
Look, anybody who's had a 2-year-old can appreciate what it means to put words to feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
it is a process. And when you teach young people how to communicate their feelings constructively, they're less likely to have behavioral challenges. When you teach young people how to resolve conflicts, they're less likely to be physical in their conflict resolution strategies.
Mm-hmm.
When you teach young people how to understand their needs and emotions, and set and achieve goals, they're more likely to set goals that are pro-social and can drive their behavior and their energies towards outcomes. So we
Yeah.
know these things are true,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't have to leave it to chance for young people to develop this. I had a story one time working in Dallas, Texas, working with an organization called Big Thought. They do great work on social emotional learning. Young person was on parole. He came to us. I said, I'm David Adams. I care a lot about SEL. He says, those are the skills that help me manage my emotions, right? I said, yeah. And he said, these are great things, but I don't understand why I had to go to prison before somebody thought this was a good thing to teach me. And
Right.
and it's true. There's no reason that our students should have to be in the discipline system, in the juvenile justice system, in the criminal justice system before
Yeah.
we stop to think we can empower them to make good choices about themselves and their communities. We know what the research is. We know what the content is. Just have to get to teaching it.
Right. Yeah. If our children are learning through consequence about this, then we're failing that system in some way.
That's right.
It needs to be preemptive care so you can circumvent any sort of consequence, because it's really a reflection on our society if our children are in juvenile detention and learning
That's
these
right.
and putting it's crazy,
Yeah.
But with that being
Our
said,
students are learning those skills either way. Why are we using discipline systems when we can just teach them?
right. Yeah, that's a whole other podcast. And, it's like it's our prison system. It's, how we teach. And I think it really needs a makeover, and this work is so important and it needs to sort of bleed into the conversation. It needs to bleed into the vernacular of how we interact. And also more so with adults, it's a really perfect way to integrate that into our lives so our children can mirror that. Like
Yeah.
our young are looking somewhere for guidance. And even if you're not sort of saying it actively, like this is what this is, they're going to mimic you,
Mm-hmm.
So it's really
This
important to.
this goes back to this idea of learning, right?
Mhm.
So you are learning regardless of whether or not people think they're teaching. And this is why social emotional learning is so important. Because when we're intentional about the learning in the social emotional domain, we help young people solve problems towards constructive ends. Young people look around, they see how we solve conflicts, they see the
Mhm.
state of our current society in terms of civil discourse. They are learning about social interactions. Let's be intentional about what they learn so that it's attached to science and can serve pro-social aims in terms of what we're trying to do in terms of constructive problem solving.
Yeah, absolutely. This brings up, social media. And, when I was growing up, we didn't have Instagram, we didn't have Facebook. It was just sort of the turn of the internet really coming out. And computers, like having computer labs was like pretty new when I was a kid. Um,
Yeah.
and so me personally, I'm on both ends where I kind of lived without computers for a while and then they just popped up, um, how do you sort of being your generation, our generation, sort of deal with AI now and deal with social media? Because even for me, I have to really, it's so hard for me to stop scrolling. It's really hard for me to not get personally affected by what I'm seeing
Mhm.
scrolling. Even as a
Yeah.
person in their 30s, I'm like, okay, this is tragic. I need to put this down because I am feeling adverse effects from this. And I can't imagine how difficult it is for a child to have that same resilience too. Like how do you cope with that? How do you deal with the emotions that sort of come with that in our modern society?
Well, it's been a point of much controversy, as you know. There have been pushes for cell phone bans in schools and in countries across the world. I don't think the research is controversial with regards to its relatively negative impact on young people, particularly young women. The reason why you want to keep scrolling is because those interfaces were designed in ways that maximize interaction and maximize engagement. And I think we need to come to a consensus around whether or not we are willing to continue to deal with the impact on students' social and emotional development, young people's mental health, in response to an industry that's really looking at selling information and advertisements. As a society, we need to understand, come to a consensus on what is the common good here. What can we do for the most amount of people? And then make a decision around what we're willing to trade off vis-a-vis access to things like smartphones in schools and student social emotional development and their mental health.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that as you're making schools a community, I think cities as a community need to band together and sort of have these sort of restraints. It's really important. But so you've received sort of national recognition for championing equity in education. I'd love to hear more about that and what does equity mean in practice, not just in theory?
It's a great question. So my focus with regards to increasing equity in public education has been around increasing access to high quality public schools to all students. So in the context of New York City, that means making sure that urban assembly schools are available and open to all students, making sure that we're solving problems that are relevant to all students, whether or not you have an IEP, whether or not you're an English language learner, whether or not you came to America yesterday, you're going to receive a high quality education in urban assembly schools. And we're going to solve for ensuring that these diverse range of learners have access to the highest quality of education. So that's been my focus. That's been where I've put my time and energy. That's where I care about when I say that the Urban Assembly is an institution that's dedicated to equity and educational equity. And that's what we develop tools around so that more schools can have access from our schools to all schools and from our kids to all kids. Our solutions are not just Urban Assembly solutions, they're public education solutions.
Right. So you co-authored the Educator's Practical Guide to Emotional Intelligence. Is that one of the tools that you use to make sure equity is in the Urban Assembly? I'd love to hear more about that and how that's sort of embedded in your system.
Sure. I mean, so we know the relationship between emotional intelligence and social emotional learning are closely linked. Book came out, I think in 1997, talking about emotional intelligence. It really spurred the field of social and emotional learning. So if we think about emotional intelligence as the output of social and emotional learning, then by naming these skills for our young people and for our staff, we are increasing access to those skills. It's not just that I know how to listen well or I'm good with people. There are a range of discrete skills that are knowable and teachable, and that when our students master, they are more effective in life, school, work, and life. And so my goal has been to make the implicit explicit. My goal has been to create access to those things that matter for students' social and emotional development, for students' economic and social mobility, and then to make sure that our students are not the only ones receiving it, that all students have access as well.
Yeah. If you could sort of, I didn't know the book was over so long ago, but if you could revise the way emotional intelligence is taught and sort of, revise sort of concepts that you had gleaned, a few years ago, what would you sort of revise in the mode of emotional intelligence and how it's taught and teacher prep and with programs today?
This is interesting. So there's been some really good research that's come out recently that has said that the duration of social and emotional learning programs doesn't have to be as long as what I had first understood in order to create long-term effects. So I'm very interested these days around thinking about how much skill development is needed, how much practice is needed, And how do we get that formula right so that schools can balance all the different things that they have to balance in order to be successful institutions? So I would look back and I would start to think about how many words do you need in order to have a robust emotional vocabulary? How many strategies do you need in order to be able to regulate your emotions effectively, so that we can support young people, but also deal with the realities of school day?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You're so right as far as like, I didn't think about that as far as making sure, you know, people like you and I are like obviously older and K through 12 than the K through 12 students. And it's like, we can go maybe all day for the most part, thinking about these and pontificating, but students, it's like, okay, let's get to it. Like that seems to be the art of social emotional learning, is when you're relaying it to kids, is making sure that you're speaking to them in their language,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and making sure that you're keeping it concise and you're keeping it brief. And it's just about the power of what you're saying, not how much you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that might go for everything too. Making sure that you're concise in what you're saying, so that you're like understanding your audience. I think that's
Yeah.
really important. So, we're coming to an end, but what practices do you rely personally on just staying grounded and emotionally present and resilient in your particular role?
Well, I do a lot of narration. I spend a lot of time recognizing the emotions that come up, trying to connect those emotions to the situations that they come up in, and then aligning those emotions to what I'm trying to accomplish in the world, right? So, being aware of what I'm feeling, being aware of what I'm trying to do, and being aware of how I'm feeling is affecting what I'm trying to do. And I might do that, 2,000-3,000 times a day. But at the end of the day, I want to live my life with intention, and my emotional intelligence skills that are developed through social and emotional learning have helped me to do that.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Um, with that self-reflection, which is something that I try to do as well in a daily practice, I think within that self-reflection, you can't help but look outside of you and sort of mirror, like, I might be presenting myself in this way, but how are people around me presenting themselves? You can't sort of help but do A versus B,
Mm-hmm.
sort of scenario in your mind. And so with that, what do you think is the biggest emotional skill that we need to cultivate right now, as a society, or in society as a whole?
I think developing self-regulation is really a key skill. It is, or a key competency, I should say. It's a grouping of many different skills, but being able to organize your behavior towards your goals and organize your emotion towards what you're trying to accomplish, I think it's something that we can all benefit from.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. And so our last question: how can listeners support the mission of the Urban Assembly and bring some of those principles into their own communities and get involved with what you're doing? I know you're in Houston, New York, and Syracuse. So how can they sort of get involved with you and bring your mission to their schools and communities?
Well, they can certainly reach out to me. I'm at dadams@urbanassembly.org. They can check out my website, urbanassembly.org. We do work across the country. Any school district in any place who wants to develop their social and emotional skills for their young people themselves should give us a reach, and we'll do what we can to support you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate, all the discussions about SEL and equity. I think this is a really important conversation to have. And so I really appreciate you being here and giving us a lot of your expertise for parents and educators and our listeners who are just trying to turn the corner on the status quo that's happening right now. So we really appreciate your insight.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. If you're inspired by David's work, again, I encourage you to learn more about the Urban Assembly and how you can support them and your own community at urbanassembly.org. And if this episode sparked something for you, please take a moment to subscribe, share with a friend, a family member, a colleague, and you can visit our website at civiltalk.com and listen to this podcast. We will have links on that page, as well as our past podcasts if you're interested in our mission. Every listen helps us grow the movement of emotional intelligence. And until next time, thank you for listening. Stay kind, stay connected. Again, thank you, David Adams, for being here today.
Cheers.